afterthought to the level of fire that we saw in 2018. And of course, we also experienced that. As I think all of you know, but maybe some background, I came to Paradise as a firefighter in 1974 and worked my way up through the department, became the fire chief in 1996 and served till 2006. And since that time, I've served as emergency operations coordinator for the town in various capacities. Also, I've realized in putting this presentation together that I have served under every council that the town has ever had, from our formation in 1979 to today. And that's ironic because I'm the most fireable person on your staff. No paperwork, nothing, just, you just have to say goodbye and, you get rid of an employee, sort of. But I've appreciated the opportunities that have been presented to me. So today we're going to talk about a perspective on emergency management. This is actually a course, as you see at the bottom of the screen sometimes, ICS Overview for Executives and Senior Officials. It's called ICS 402 or Incident Command System 402. And it's actually blended with another course called Introduction to National Incident Management System and Standardized Emergency Management System. So I'll give you a lot of acronyms today. If you don't already know those, you'll be more knowledgeable. You'll be able to talk in fire acronyms. How we got here today. Let's go back a year behind this. This shows a slide from 1991 that was a game changer in California. But the year before was the game changer for Paradise. Because for those that don't know or don't remember or weren't here, in 1990, we had our first, as a town, significant disaster. And it wasn't a fire. It was a snowstorm. You have a little bit of detail in the handout that I gave you today about the history of emergency operations in Paradise. And, but the overview was that we had a snowstorm that collapsed the bowling alley, a supermarket, a drugstore, numerous buildings. There were fatalities, thousands of trees down. It took us months and months to recover from road closures. We had power out in parts of town for up to 2 weeks. And that was our first test, and we were not prepared for it. We really had not done the kind of emergency planning that we've done since. It was sort of our wake-up call for the town of Paradise to say, we need to do a better job of being prepared for emergencies, because we pretty much winged that one. It was a significant event that we had to learn as we went. And from then on, we decided we would do better at town emergency management. The following year, a major event occurred that changed the game for California. In 1991, the Oakland Hills fire occurred. And there was a recognition by Senator Petrus that we were not prepared in many cases, in the Oakland in particular, for major emergencies. And he wrote a bill that became known as was SB 1841, but was known as the Petrus Bill, that created fire safe councils and shake roofs in California, untreated shake roofs in California, and created standardized emergency management system, which basically says that we will all manage emergencies in California under this standardized system. And it has 4 components: incident command system, interagency coordination, which is usually done through OES or the OES system, California Master Mutual Aid, and what's known as the operational area concept. So I think you all know, but you might not know, that the operational area for us, our OES coordinator, is the county. In California, all but one county is split into 2, are operational areas. That's our, you might say, pathway to emergency resources, and emergency coordination is through our operational area coordinator. So those 4 concepts came out of the SIMS model, and that we started down the road. So it's a carrot stick kind of a thing. The carrot is that we get funding for training, for equipment through this system. And the stick is that if you don't comply with SIMS, you technically might not be eligible for some of those activities. It also means that you have to have an active and current emergency management plan for your community, and that's part of the SIMS components as well. And we do, right now, we're looking at our current plan, which was last upgraded, I believe, in 2011. And I think you might have already heard that there's discussion about the need to take the Campfire after action issues and use that to upgrade the 2011 plan to a 2021 plan. And feel free to interrupt and if you have questions. So then, go ahead. Anybody? 10 years later, another significant event occurred, and when this became a national event, 911. The outfall of 911 was that the commissions that were gathered to evaluate the response said, we don't have a good response system in this country. We don't have a good national response system. It didn't exist. In 2001, it did not exist. There was no standardized approach. We've been very fortunate in the Western United States to be using ICS, or Incident Command System, since the 80s. But that is not true, was not true across the country. So out of that, they created National Incident Management System, which we are all under. And the idea was to create a consistent federal response to how to prepare for, prevent, respond to, and recover from, and mitigate the effects of emergencies in order to serve our public better, in order to better be prepared. And that model actually is a fairly concise document. From it came the National Response Framework. And the National Response Framework is a very simple, flexible doctrine, probably very much unlike you would normally expect to see from a federal document. It's very simple, very easy to read, and very understandable. And it basically says there's this standardized method, and we all, again, need to learn this system. And we were very far ahead of this in Paradise. We were already using almost all the doctrines and principles and terminology of because of SIMS partly, but because of our preparedness by the time that National Incident Management System was created. It was actually signed into law in 2005. So our national system for response is pretty new. It's pretty new and cutting edge. And we're not going to be here as long as the blocked out time, because it's going to go fairly fast, but I hope that you'll have some questions down the road. So NIMS components include preparedness, communications and information management, resource management, command and management, which is actually managing an emergency, coordinating public information, and then ongoing management and maintenance is kind of what we're doing today. It wasn't a one-time, we'll lay it out in 2005, 6, 7, and then everybody will know it. It needs to be constantly trained on, updated, and part of your emergency plans for a community. So when we develop our plans, no matter what emergency plan we develop, it needs to be compliant with SIMS and NIMS. So we have to make sure that all of the elements of SIMS and NIMS are in there. And if you're thinking, well, this is a pretty bureaucratic sounding approach to things, it actually is a pretty sensible, straightforward, fairly streamlined approach to things. When we get into we're not going to talk a great deal today about recovery, but when we get into the recovery side, that's where it becomes convoluted, as most of you on the council now know. On the response side, it was pretty straightforward, and we'll talk about that more when we get to how we manage our own emergencies and what we do in an EOC. So NIMS components have to be built into all of our readiness operations, and they are. All of our plans are compliant with both SIMS and NIMS. Another thing that is important is, and I hate slides with just words on them, but is that we need to institutionalize this. And this is in part where you come in. It's important for you to understand as elected officials that this needs to be built into how we do business. It needs to be part of our DNA, that we use these systems, we conduct training, we conduct exercises, we do after action reports, and then we reevaluate, and then we fix it, and then we move forward and we do it all again. That it never stops, that it requires a certain amount of support from the elected officials to make sure that we have funding for it, because this stuff just doesn't happen. A lot of it is free, training time today is free, but it's not always free. You have to spend time on equipment. You have to make sure that your technology is up to speed. You have to send people to training. It's all in part of how we are really prepared for an emergency. So as government officials, it's critical that we understand the value of supporting through policy, through procedure, and through funding ongoing emergency preparedness. So the National Response Framework, which is only I think it's about a 75-page document. You think, a typical bill is thousands of pages long. The framework for managing emergencies in this country is only 75 or so pages long. Says that, and this is a really important emphasis for us all, is you see individuals and households on that diagram. The National Response Framework said it is critical for individuals to understand that they are part of the national response to emergencies. Private sector, non-governmental organizations, we assume that. We assume that the Red Cross, that, Salvation Army, that other organizations will help. But it is responsible, and that has to be an ongoing part of our community preparedness plans and information, is that it's incumbent for a successful emergency that individuals take responsibility. Then when you get to the actual response, local government responds, and when it can't handle the emergency, the state provides support, and then at last resort, as certainly in the Campfire, the federal government provides support. And I want to, separate the recovery from the response here. For those of you who might remember the days, the three of you that sat, on the council when we were in those early days after the Campfire, there was a presence from FEMA, but they did not run our show. We ran our show and they supported it. In those response days, we were in charge. We set the objectives, we set the agenda, and they provided resources to help us do that. And that's how the response is supposed to work. When we get to recovery, I'm going to say it's a little trickier, but on the response side, it worked like it was supposed to work. They didn't come in and tell us what our job was. They didn't come in and tell us what our objectives were. They simply asked, what can we do to help? And then we wrote financial requests under the disaster declaration to do that. Is there any questions on that? No? Well, I must be either I'm very clear or it's right after lunch and you're all ready for your nap. So again, the National Response Framework establishes a comprehensive plan that includes all partners. That's public, private, non-governmental, tribal, and it creates a framework for us to work from. And it allows us to access the resources that we need in a relatively timely manner. I'd say that when we got our resources during the Campfire, that most of the resources for the response side were timely. There was a few glitches in things like shelter support, things like that we had some glitches in because of the sheer volume of need. But overall, I'd have to say that it held up fairly well. So that brings us to what is Incident Command System, because Incident Command System is one of the major components of both SIMS and NIMS. Incident Command System was developed in California in the early 70s, and in a response to what we all know happens in Southern California, and now it's happening more frequently in Northern California, but extensive fire sieges that tax the resources and put a lot of different agencies who normally didn't work together into the same command and response. So a group called FireScope got together and created this organization called ICS, and we still to this day, from the early 70s, almost to the letter, use the same version of ICS that was created, which shows you how well it's held up over time. There have been a few minor additions to it, but incident command system is still how emergency managers run incidents in California and across the country to this day. So an incident, we know we've had plenty of them. If you look down our list of things that we've encountered in the town of Paradise, our first major emergency, of course, as I stated earlier, was a snowstorm. But of course, we've had flooding in 95, 96, 97. We've had major wind events. And of course, we know that we've had fire as our major emergency. But we frequently, if you look at our, do you guys have that handout that I have on the partial history of EOC activation and preparedness? Would you pull that out if you should have that?
We have a handout, but it's the EOC action plan.
It's attached.
There should be two of them.
In the agenda.
Oh,
There should be two
there
documents
it
or
is.
two, or two
Okay.
together.
found it.
Okay, so you can see that as you go down, you can see that we've had a long history of significant fires and EOC activations. I think it's really important for this council and every council in Paradise to understand that not everyone does what we do. Not everyone manages emergencies as actively as we do in the town of Paradise. And I think that's to our credit. We have recognized the need that, you have a major windstorm and major roads are closed, or a snowstorm and the roads are closed, power's out, trees are on things like we had a few weeks ago that fell on my shed and knocked the power out because a big cedar went across Pence Road in front of my house. That we have a need to be able to respond to those because the public is affected. And our number one mission in most of those emergencies is to provide current and accurate information to the public so they know what's going on. But it also requires a response from fire department, public works, police department to help mitigate those emergencies. So our goal in an incident is there's a phenomenon that occurs, and our job is to minimize the loss of life and damage because of that emergency. And you can see that, you go down this list: significant snowstorm in 95, flooding in 96, flooding in 97. I think out of all of you, I don't know Rose as well, but certainly Greg remembers the flooding that we had in 95, 96. And if for those that don't know, what happened, we had all the roads like Billy with the dips between Skyway and Elliott, and Wagstaff between Skyway and Clark, were full of water. We actually had flooding through houses. The good news about Paradise and flooding is that gravity is our friend. And eventually that flooding became more Butte County and then regional because all the water went away. But we have had some pretty significant flooding. And I think that one of the reasons I bring that up is because it isn't just that we haven't had as many rainstorms, which we haven't, but the fact that we mitigated those issues by putting in better, bigger drainage systems. And while we still could have flooding in some of those same areas, we've largely mitigated the problems by responding to those emergencies, both during and after. So some of it's history that precedes us. I mean, we haven't. Most of this council hasn't physically experienced it, but the town has both responded to, mitigated, and then in in the after incident, taking care of those issues. We also know that when you get right down to it, we all know what our number one emergency is, and that's the potential for wildfire. And that hit us in a very devastating way, of course, on November 8th, 2018. Timeframes. Well, how long will a complex incident last? Well, I guess you could say that the Campfire is still lasting. That ought to show you how long a Katrina, that level of emergency can last a long time. So we know there are complexity factors. When I teach these classes to people who've never experienced a major emergency, I have to explain what complexity is. I don't think I have to explain complexity to you. You understand complexity because we're living in complexity. When you have such significant impact to every aspect of your community, that is complexity. So how do you know when the incident's over? Well, our incident technically is over, but there's a quasi extension to it because our unique tree program that we have is actually an extension of the emergency because the funding is still A funding. It's still under the disaster response funding, correct? Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
So here we are 2 years and a few months later, and we're still actively responding to an aspect of the emergency. The incident command system is a standardized approach that adopts all aspects. Can be single jurisdictional, multi-jurisdictional, could be all hazards. It uses best practices to help us maintain the safety of our responders and efficient use of resources. It is a legally mandated requirement of Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5 and Presidential Directive 8 for national preparedness, meaning it is the law in the United States that you will use the National Response Framework and ICS as part of your emergency management process. And of course, we know here, all the ways that you can use ICS. We've seen it in our county in just about every way that you can think of, including COVID, most recently the snowstorm and a windstorm, but it could be national security, it could be a criminal act, a terrorist act. Now we're seeing that kind of thing that could come to the forefront again. So it can be used for any kind of emergency, bottom line. And we know this is 2008. And in 2008, it was significant incident command response and then a significant EOC response by both us and the county, and with help from our state and somewhat our federal partners. And of course, we learned lessons, which is part of the process of managing an emergency, is that you take lessons that you learn from the after action and review and turn it into corrective actions and then plan accordingly. Ironically, I don't think it's the irony is missed by those who understand what this line meant. This is the back of the line in the Humboldt fire that caused us to change our emergency plan to even more want to compartmentalize evacuation, which in turn backfired in the Campfire, in a sense. Only in my mind, because the Campfire was so off the charts unique that I think every one of us has stated in different ways, there was no way on November 8th to evacuate the entire town at one time fast. It just physically wasn't possible with the road system that we have, with the amount of people we put on the road. But the lessons that we learned from 2008 still apply, because we still know that there's a need to control the flow of evacuation when you can do it. And so we've applied those lessons, but we added new lessons learned from 2008 to our evacuation plan. And that's all part of the ICS and NIMS and SIMS process, is to learn, adapt, and then move forward and implement. And then, of course, we had the Campfire, and I think that's something that I want to put in perspective for you. You've all been involved in it in some way or another, whether you lived it or were on the council or in some capacity. The Campfire is such an outlier to fires. Yeah, we know now the Woolsey fire burned, the Campfire burned, and the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa burned, and the Carr fire burned, and we know that now that significant major events are more frequent than they used to be. But the Campfire stands alone as the third worst wildfire disaster in the history of the country. And the other ones were spread by a long way. The first one was in 1876. The second one was in 1910. And the third in 2008. So we're talking about off the charts difference between this fire and even the Tubbs or the Carr or the Woolsey. It's exponentially different. And so therefore our response and our learning from the Campfire have to be tempered by the fact that that was a very unique fire. We could have another major fire that would do a lot of damage, but the Campfire for the moment stands as the worst fire in California history. I hope it always stands as the worst fire in California history, to be honest, not for our own notoriety, but for the benefit of whatever community might be faced with something like this in the future. It's very telling when you look at these pictures and you see the gap between the flames and you know that the fire's ahead of the fire, burning back the opposite direction. And for those that have probably seen this 1,000 times, the fire in the left side underneath the Paradise, where it says Paradise, is a fire burning out of Butte Creek Canyon back into town from the opposite way towards Skyway, toward our escape routes. Very challenging day. We all know that. So what are the benefits of having a system like ICS? Well, it meets the needs of any incident. I will say that the Campfire challenged incident command system for a while, but really they maintained a set of objectives throughout that were followed. Logistically, maintaining control of resources became a challenge because you pretty much had to go to independent action, which is unusual, but it's still the best system out there for managing emergencies. So we're going to talk a little bit about the features of ICS. What are the components of ICS? It creates unique position titles. It means that on a given day, I might work for somebody who normally ranks lower than me. But more importantly, it sets a common set of terminology. It establishes a clear chain of command and unity of command, meaning I know who my boss is, who I work for. Very, very clear. Those are very clear and important concepts of both our EOC and the ICS system. A clear chain of command and unity of command, which means one person, one boss. You know who you work for. And that is, as a note, is where it can become extremely difficult with elected officials. And I'm not necessarily singling out anybody from our town, but I work with, in my teaching capacity, I teach all over Northern California. I particularly enjoy teaching in rural counties, but I have to, remind elected officials in particular in many places that if you start changing the order or changing the directives that are given by the chain of command, you basically are going outside of unity of command and creating potential chaos, and sometimes dangerous chaos. So, you know, we all have to remember that where we fit in the organization, and no matter how much I know, I have to understand and delegate authority to people who are managing the emergency. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The incident commander, or in our case for the EOC, the EOC director, is usually the most qualified person at the scene. I was very fortunate to, by some of you, to be appointed as the EOC director. So when you see, for the Campfire, when you see incident commander role, that also holds with the EOC director. It's the same position in a similar but different type of organization. And their role is overall leadership, overall policy direction, and they take their policy direction from you as elected officials. Policy direction. So senior officials receive policy direction, and then that is they're delegated by those elected officials to manage the emergency on a day-to-day basis, establish relationships, and then number one and above all, the most important thing of the commander's role from my perspective, besides managing people and systems, is establishing objectives. So every day we work from an action plan that is basically a set of objectives for that given day. And it's important to understand the difference between command and coordination, because command is a direct order given, and coordination is us talking amongst ourselves and coordinating activities. So while in all emergency situations, either the EOC director or the incident commander are doing both at the same time. They're both commanding resources, giving them directives and direct orders to do an activity, and they're also coordinating with other agencies and people to manage the emergency. Two separate items, but two very important items. Command is the explicit authority to manage incident operations. That's what you are delegating by ordinance and by state law to your managers in the EOC. Your director, your police chief has this direct authority by statute, California. The ability to command incident operations in law enforcement. Staff positions in the EOC will be the information officer, who coordinates all information on behalf of the incident commander or EOC director, the liaison officer, who works with other agencies, coordinates with other agencies, and the safety officer, who's responsible for the safety of the responders, the staff. So every organization you see, every organizational chart you see in one of our action plans, if it's a significant event of any kind, you'll see all these positions filled. Then we have what's known as the general staff. The operations section in our case usually is comprised of police department, fire department, and public works. Planning section is responsible for putting out action plans, gathering intelligence, maintaining the status of the incident. Logistics section gets stuff. They acquire resources. And finance section, well, they became hugely important, obviously, and they always are, because they track cost and make sure that all the records are right. And we all know how important that was in cost recovery for our response during the fire. Incident management teams, like you'll hear and you'll see the hats, the red hats, when CAL FIRE comes in, they say it's Incident Management Team 3 is running the incident. Those are pre-built teams that train together and work together on incidents. They're on call. Usually there's at least 2 CAL FIRE teams and 3 or 4 U.S. Forest Service teams on call at any given time year round, ready to go to any emergency of any type, anywhere. And then when they come in, you probably, I know some of you have interacted with those red hats from CAL FIRE especially during the Campfire And that's a team that has worked together for usually quite a while and comes in and is delegated authority by the local unit chief to manage the emergency. So John Messina right now, Chief Messina, who's now the unit chief, would delegate authority through the Campfire system for that incident management team to have the authority to run the emergency here in Butte County. Oops. When you hit the B, it goes blank. When you hit the N, it goes next. So who does what? So if you go into the EOC, you walk into the EOC and you want to know what's happening where, the command should be setting the overall objectives. The operations should be running the on-the-ground tactics, evacuations, road closures, firefighting, flood control, sandbagging, whatever those issues are. That's where operations handles that. Planning develops the action plans and also maintains the status of what's going on, weather reports, where the roads are closed, what trees are down, what power's out, all those things. And then logistics, of course, acquires the resources while finance monitors and tracks the cost and does the paperwork to ensure that if there is a disaster declaration, we have the paperwork necessary to receive reimbursement or funding. It's a modular system. It can be very small. We might have a traffic accident in town. It might have an incident commander and 2 resources assigned to it. That's still ICS for us. It might grow to a little bit and be a small house fire or a building fire, and you might have a couple of more resources assigned and a couple more boxes filled. But as the incident grows, so do the number of resources required to be managed. And one of the primary principles of incident command system is maintaining span of control. So no boss should be, in charge of 20 resources. They should have 5, 6, 7, 8 resources that they can easily manage safely under them. So span of control is a key concept. But as it expands, we need more resources. We expand the amount of boxes that are filled, and those boxes each are comprised of resources. A search group is a whole bunch of people in a team looking. EMS group are the medical people. Investigation group are the people investigating. In this case, it's a lost person, so they're investigating last known source, last known location, clothes people were wearing, how many there are, ages, what they have with them, things like that. And each of those teams falls under the operations section, and you notice that there's a command staff, a small command staff, but not a big general staff, because it's a small emergency. It doesn't need a separate planning section chief. It doesn't need a logistics section chief. Once hundreds are on the scene, though, you will start to need planning, and you will start to need logistics. And you need to start planning for not just today's operation, but tomorrow's operation and the next day's operation, like we did for the Campfire. And then once you get to major emergencies, you start seeing more and more boxes filled till you get to the size of a Campfire, where virtually every box in the organization was filled during the response to the Campfire. The more complex the incident, the more resources needed, the more organizational structure that's required. I'm not even going to ask that. That's just too simple for us. We manage by objectives. So we set objectives for each operational period. An operational period might be a day. It might be multiple days. It might be a few hours. I'll give you an example of what an operational period is and sort of how I normally explain it. It's the period of time for which the objectives are valid. Okay, that sounds like a backward way of saying it. So let's say that somebody has fallen into a lake. The operational period, the objectives are to rescue them from the lake, which implies trying to save their life. In reality, and I hope somebody will give me an answer, how long do we have before it's no longer a rescue? Submerged in a lake.
Not long.
Yeah, minutes, right?
20 minutes, maybe?
Yeah, maybe in cold water, you might be able to extend that out a little bit, but yeah, we're talking minutes. So for that operational period, for that objective is measured in minutes. However, if we're putting out a house fire and I say I'm going to confine the fire to the room of origin, it's once again in minutes. But in a typical wildland fire, we usually set objectives that are either for 12 hours or 24 hours. We're going to put line in and control the edge of the fire along Skyway between Chico and the Paradise Town limit, and we're going to give ourselves a day to do that. So the operational period for that particular incident is 24 hours. So when you look at look at your action plan that you have in front of you, and we'll look at it more in a minute, it will show that I believe it's a 2-day action plan. The objectives were set for 2 days, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. We set our objectives based on overall priorities of life safety, stabilizing the incident, and then property and environmental conservation. And the action plan is how we state our objectives, identify our organization. In small incidents, almost all of our action plans are verbal, and in large incidents, they're like what you have in front of you. They're written. Hold on a second. I'm not going to talk a lot about resource management, but you can only imagine how many resources were being managed during the campfire. I can't even give you a complete number, but it was in the thousands at peak, meaning fire resources, team searching, road crews, tree removal, literally thousands of people being managed. And just wanted to understand that under Incident Command System, we have a very organized way of categorizing, ordering, dispatching, and tracking resources. So we know on any given time, I can tell you that even in a major fire, we know where every resource is at any given time during the incident. Now, during the initial phases of the campfire, that wasn't necessarily true, the first 6 hours. But typically speaking, on any given day, at any given time, if you go to the resource unit of an incident under planning section, they can tell you where everything is, what it's doing. It also is important because that's how you get reimbursed, is by tracking time and making sure that ensuring that those resources were used appropriately is part of the process for being reimbursed for their use after an incident. So we track our resources carefully, because if we're using a public resource unit like a public safety, let's say even a snowplow, and we're looking to get reimbursed, we have to have a clear tracking of the time that resource was used and what it was used for. We also have tried to have integrated communications. I will say that in the campfire and in every major emergency, not just the campfire, integrated communications and real-time communications is our biggest challenge. It still is. It's always been on the list of trying to make it better, but there is no greater challenge in real time than to have integrated communications. It just, we all talk on different radio systems. We're busy. We can't monitor only so many radio frequencies at one time. And that's where breakdowns begin to occur. So constantly being worked on, not just at the local level, but nationally. I'm just going to give just a quick one slide. This is actually a whole unit to itself, but unified command means that sometimes we run emergencies. We recognize that the incident affects more than one jurisdiction that has authority. And so we create a unified command, meaning each agency has a commander in the unified command. And certainly the campfire was a unified command. So I'd like to take a short break if possible before I go into EOCs and ask a Questions? Yes, no? Comments? Positive, negative, something?
It doesn't look like there's any questions, Jim.
Hey, Jim.
Okay.
Jim,
Yeah.
I got one, of course. Hey, like you were just talking about that part, like, okay, communications, like when everything fell apart, right? Do we have like those backup plans? I mean, I know maybe we didn't in the Campfire, but do we now?
I would say the answer to that bluntly right now is no, but it's being worked on.
Okay.
It's not a small fix.
No, I understand.
And I don't even mean locally. I mean statewide or nationally. It's, we are working on our own fixes, and as part of the corrective action process, we will develop redundancies. That's part of our goal, is to have redundant systems. And let me give you an example of a redundant system that we're exploring. How many of you ever heard of General Mobile Radio Systems? Okay, GMRS. Well, GMRS is becoming a thing here in Butte County. A GMRS is something between a ham radio and a CB. And what it allows you to do is have a radio system that uses old technology, basically, to communicate. So ham is a great old technology. It's very reliable, and that needs to be kind of part of our system. But we're exploring also things like GMRS radio as another way that when other systems break down, it stands alone as a way to communicate. So what is that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, I just know from listening to the scanner that morning, that like even early on, even Cal Fire's communication system was inoperable. They weren't able to talk to engines I know a lot of things broke down as a fire burnt stuff up. And so I was just wondering, in part of the plan, you just, what is, as a result of what happened in 2018, do we have, if nothing else, idea, I know we don't have the redundancy built yet, but do we have like, okay, if that should happen again, here's what we do, whether it's cell phones or, is there anything? Is there,
Yes.
Yeah, that was a question.
Yes, and it's still in its infant stage, but there's a lot of different again, redundancies that are being built into the system. Cal Fire's system, we don't have any control over, but they have learned a lot from that as well. And I think it was a combination, as you all know, of two things. One was that the systems themselves were failing because mechanical pieces of the system were burning. And secondly, because there was so much radio traffic, because there was so much going on simultaneously, that it was impossible to keep up with. So two things kind of came together on that particular incident. And yes, that means you have to build redundancies in that, don't rely on the same system that allow you to do workarounds. And that's all being looked at as part of the corrective action.
Great, thanks.
And kind of on that same thing, Jim, I have a question. During the Bear Fire that got into forestry land, and when it kind of left Cal Fire's jurisdiction and went into forestry land, and then it came back, there was a definite lack of information being shared from the forestry department to Cal Fire, which that was under one of our PSPS evacuation warnings, and no power. A lot of people didn't have internet, and there seemed to be a lot of information that wasn't being shared with Cal Fire from the forestry department, and that really needs to be fixed, because that prevented a lot of information from being shared with our citizens. So is anything being done with that?
Yeah, a lot of lessons learned from the North Complex. And we, both from us, meaning here in the town, we actually talked about that we have a team now. All of our major emergency managers are part of what's called the emergency planning team. And we've discussed some of those things specifically. Evacuation language, coordination between organizations, evacuation mapping are all on the table and being worked on. There was an aspect of that incident that really caused problems, and CAL FIRE, to their credit, was the ones who finally solved it, which was when the fire emphasis moved back into Plumas County. We lost, any real contact with the fire. And CAL FIRE pressed on Forest Service to create a presence, whether it be, on virtual or whatever, and do public meetings in Butte County or open meetings in Butte County about what was going on, because the fire was not in our county. And to them, it was threatening Quincy and Bucks Lake and Meadow Valley, not us. So their focus was Plumas County. And you're right. Everything you said was correct. There's absolutely correct. We lost a period of time where there was just very poor communications about what was going on in that fire, and literally had to be pried out. I think Forest Service learned a big lesson there. They learned a lesson that when they have a fire upwind of us, meaning if a north wind were to blow or an east wind were to blow, that they need to keep us as part of their who they're communicating with. And it took a bit of, I got to say, some work to get them to understand. They didn't think about it this way. In Plumas County, and it's threatening Bucks Lake, and it's threatening Meadow Valley, and it's threatening Quincy, they're not thinking about the fear it's creating in Magalia. They're not seeing that. So they had to be convinced that that was a big deal. And I think that there were some great lessons learned from the North Complex about fires that may be in an adjoining county but affect us directly.
Jim, on that note too, like you guys need to, that team you got, you need to guys, somebody needs to rein PG&E in, because them doing a PSPS during a major wildfire to prevent a fire from starting, that was ridiculous. Nobody had any access to news, any kind of communication, because our power was out,
Yeah, I wish we had some. Yeah, you know better though. We don't control PG&E. We have some really good liaisons. I don't know if you know this, but they've hired David Hawks, who was our former fire chief,
right,
and as a PG&E liaison to fire emergencies. And we have a little bit more of what I'd call a direct line to get information and to communicate with PG&E about what's going on. That said, it's PG&E.
No, I understand, but if somebody,
we don't regulate PG&E.
There's got to be a conversation with people that are making the decisions at the ISO or wherever they do, as far as PSPSs. I get the point and all that, but they have to let them know, if you're in a major, they kill all communication with a lot of people, when they do that. And that is, they got to bear some responsibility for.
I know that there are some very direct things that PG&E is doing to minimize PSPSs in general, and PSPS impacts in communities like Magalia. You're familiar with the fact that Magalia is going to be a microgrid in the core area?
Yeah.
So what that means is that you'll have power and communications in the Lake Ridge to Skyway block, and there'll be a community center there that's powered, which at least allows, I'm not saying that's an answer, but it's a partial answer, because it at least allows somebody in Magalia to understand, to go someplace and get direct answers about what's going on in their community. It's a step in the right direction, but there's a long way to go. But these are good questions, because they are what we face as both emergency managers, working with our partners and our cooperators and our associated agencies in trying to solve these problems after. And they're good questions. Okay. So moving on, we're going to talk about what's more pertinent to you. and I hope you understand what I was giving you. I was giving you that big perspective of where we fit in the big scheme of things. And now we're going to get a little bit more down to earth about what we do and how emergency operations centers function, not just in Paradise, but in general, but also specifically in Paradise. Emergency operations centers fall into a broader category called multi-agency support and coordination. And they're a place where we make policy decisions, we establish priorities, we talk about critical resources, and we coordinate and support the emergency itself. So obviously we didn't run the fire from the town's emergency operations center located in the Chico EOC. We coordinated and supported the efforts needed for the town of Paradise with the incident command system, with the Campfire incident management team or the unified command team. So that's, kind of our role is support and coordination. That's really a key to what an EOC does. What your roles as senior and elected officials is to provide policy guidance and priorities, and to monitor and support the EOC operation. So you don't direct resources, you don't command resources, but you provide overall policy and direction, usually in advance. Most of it's done in advance. So through the emergency operation plan, through approving the plan, through approving the corrective action report from the Campfire, by delegating authority to the town manager and other staff. Those are the policies that you've created that set up our ability to implement our emergency plan. Oops, I lost you guys.
Oh,
And look who's in the picture. When was this taken? That was your trivia question. This is 2008. And this is in right where you are, which serves as our emergency operations center. And our director at that time would be, Chuck. And I'm giving a briefing from the field, from the incident to the, command and general staff of our emergency operations center about, where we stand. And how many of you attended briefings in our EOC in either like for Steve's or Woody's case, 2008, or in the Campfire? How many of you did that?
Did the Campfire.
2008, that's me, next to you,
Yeah.
making sure you did it right.
That's probably right after you forgot to get me my sandwich at CNA. We'll talk about that some other time. And of course, this is an example of what happens. This is the planning section of our EOC in 2008 in our own, building. And you see displays on the wall that talk about the road closures, map of the fire, locations for evacuation centers, evacuated areas. This is where, where in this case, Al McGrean, who was our planning section chief, is maintaining the status of the emergency and displaying it for everyone and helping build the incident action plan for the next operational period.
Hey, Jim?
Yeah.
Explain the importance of why everybody during an active EOC, why everybody must log in and out and timed clocking in and out, because that was real important.
So I hope that everyone gets that, is that we have two or three ways that we document for reimbursement purposes. And trust me, they were scrutinized. I remember, just to give you an example, I'll give you an example in a minute for me, but we maintain what's called a 214, which is a unit log. It's like a diary. And those 214s are turned in at the end of each day or operational period to the either the check-in location or to the resources unit of planning. Eventually they make it to finance. And then on top of that, there's a sign-in sheet that you sign in and out of. And to give you the idea how closely they scrutinize that, my sign-ins didn't match my 214s from the Campfire for 2 or 3 days, and I worked there for 17 days. And so I had to go back through my records and figure out the discrepancy of why my check-in and check-out didn't match my 214. So if you think, well, how close does the paperwork scrutinize? It's scrutinized. It's critical, and that's all part of when you file that claim with FEMA. All of that documentation supports all those dollars that we get back from the government. And if you don't have the documentation, they don't give you the dollars. And give you an example of what happened in the floods of 96, 97 in the county. The county was, almost every county in Northern California got a bill 5 years later for unsubstantiated cost. And if they didn't have the records to substantiate that cost, they had to give back money that they were given from the FEMA disaster declaration. So yeah, it's important. Does that answer the question, Woody?
Yeah.
Jim, this is Jody. You're showing a picture of the EOC here in Town Hall, and our EOC is still here in Town Hall. During the Campfire, the early hours of the Campfire prior to evacuating this EOC, the communication between the people here in the EOC, the town manager, disintegrated. And I know that Lauren told me she was not able to talk to Cal Fire, she was not able to talk to the police. What is being done to fix that if we're going to leave the EOC at Town Hall?
Well, again, the redundant systems, I think going back to GMRS radio, that may be one of the ways that we are able to create a hard link to key locations.
But we don't have anything right now. If we have an emergency tomorrow.
Right now. It's going to be a work in progress. We don't have the answer to your question right now. What Katie, and I think Katie's listening, is been working on is through IT a redundant system for communication, and that is on the agenda. Is being worked on as part of the post-incident recovery and Campfire corrective action report. So there are steps taken.
Do you have a time frame for when that might be actually working?
I would say that we'll have a level of redundancy by this fire season. I won't say that the project will be complete.
But Jim, so I would have I would know that I'd have a lot of confidence in an IT redundant program, because that's what, Cal Fire has a pretty good communication program. But in the 08 fire, and I don't know, I wasn't here in the Campfire, there was a Cal Fire person in the EOC almost at all times, and they had direct links. So I don't know if that just didn't happen in the early phases of the Campfire or not, but, because they had communication with their crews to where the incident commander could, the EOC director could have got updates and all. Because
so
all
yes,
that stuff broke.
The liaison program it worked during the Campfire. It just didn't work during the first morning. Because just physically people couldn't get to where you wanted to be. But from those days forward, when we, and that's been identified in both the corrective action report and the after action report, from those days forward, when we were able to put a liaison on each side, we put one in the county's EOC and at the incident command post, and then vice versa, they put one in our EOC, it went really well. So yeah, it broke down on that morning because everything broke down.
Yeah, no, I get it.
And things like GMRS radio are sort of an answer to those kind of communications issues. But as far as that liaison position that is being described, we still use that, and it was used quite effectively once we got to day 2 of the fire. In the early morning hours, I'll give you an example of how it was working. I serve as a field observer for the EOC during the early stages of an incident and then ongoing. And I go out in the field and I report in. So here's what my report sounded like. And I was able to talk to Lauren and to George Morris, who, was there for us. translating what was going on in the field. Here's what it looked like, because some of you all experienced this. All I could tell her was that there's fire everywhere.
Yeah.
I could only travel a few blocks at a time before I hit traffic jams. So my size of the world that I was able to report from the field was literally a few blocks out of a fire that was taking place over 20 square miles. And that was pretty much the major breakdown, was that no one person, no 5 people could do anything but tell you, I'm in this location and this is the situation. And pretty much everybody gave the same report. There's fire everywhere.
And that's like when IT solution, you're gonna have the same thing in that type of an incident. You know, people, there are traffic jams, you can't get around and see it. And so who's gonna, power's out, and so, it's gonna be weird.
Short of a helicopter flying over, which of course was, difficult as well, and telling you, giving you reports, there was no physical way, even for the communications at work, because I was able to talk to the EOC from the field until they left, but my reports were so limited in nature, because I could see so little of it at a time, that they really weren't helpful. I was actually on the other end going, why is there traffic at Wagstaff and Pence? Why is there a line of cars at Wagstaff and Pence? I'm trying to find out the answers. And of course,
because of the 2 lanes in the middle of town.
Because, well, it was a little more than that. It was really to me, it was the bottleneck at Pearson and at Skyway.
Sure.
Because that's where all the eastbound stuff hit the north-southbound stuff, and it just, stopped traffic. But I couldn't see that, and I didn't know why. So I'm not making excuses, but I am explaining the circumstances of that morning were so phenomenal. Here's some things that we plan to do in the future, and I'm a big advocate of, is webcams. Now you say, well, webcams will go out, but they wouldn't have been out right away. And we now have a network of webcams that PG&E has put in, but I think as part of our siren alert warning system, we should continue to pursue as many webcams as we can, which would give you a visual, multiple location visual of what's going on in the community. So that's another example. I'm not saying it's the answer. I'm saying it's another example of the layers that we're talking about as we move forward that will be implemented, as funding comes forward and as pieces and parts are implemented. And that would also possibly include some communication towers, and in key locations, possibly, battery or generator backed up relays. So those are all, things that we'll be working through, and each step of the way we'll add on improvements until all the layers are in place over time.
Just out of curiosity, why do you have the command center here in Town Hall instead of, for say, like at the police department?
We used to have it at the police department. There are really no facilities at the police department to manage an EOC. The town hall is our new model. Katie, I think I'm not going to get into the weeds too much with Katie, but really town hall allows you to do a couple things. It has pros and cons. It's not the greatest facility in the world, so it needs to be improved if we're going to continue to use it as our EOC, but it does allow a centralized place where people have their resources already at hand, their supplies, but the police department only has that little upstairs room, and it's really limited. Yeah, it could be functional for the operations section, possibly, but not as a full EOC. Any other questions?
Maybe just for Rose's benefit, the long-term recovery plan has in it a future project to build a municipal center that would include an EOC at a new police department, but the one we have right now is really small.
Yeah, and limited. I mean, there's no doubt about that the down the road plan would be to have a a better situated emergency operations center. One of the things that we separate, well, I'm not going to get into details there. This is our Chico EOC. This is one of our EMA teams. I wanted to explain what EMA teams were. This is actually two of our EMA teams.
We're no longer seeing that? Oh, there
You're
it
not
is.
seeing?
Now we do.
Okay. In a transition between teams, one of the things that you get through the state mutual aid system is the ability to bring in emergency managers as mutual aid. So EMA, Emergency Management Mutual Aid. So this is two teams, one coming in, one going out. We took a picture in our EOC in Chico. And we had a very high functioning EOC in Chico, by the way. And that started on day 2 of the incident. Day 1 was, just get through the day. I mean, to be honest. And by day 2, we were running and operating as a functional EOC, thanks to the support of Chico and allowing us to use this facility, which is a much better technological facility than ours. I'd love to see a room, that's set up as well as theirs, but it has some drawbacks as well, but it served us well and we appreciated the opportunity to use it. This is a briefing in the EOC being given by both state and federal officials. And so we held, you see the governor, I think, is in this one. I see him to the left there. And, so we had, and you can now see the layout, see all the computers in the center. Then there were stations on each, on the right and left side of the room. So we had a pretty, again, robust emergency operations center in our Chico setting. Of course, we had special visitors. Our Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then of course the late Phil John there. He was a EOC volunteer, had worked for us for years in a volunteer capacity. So let's get more specific about, your role. Executive officials delegate authority and allows the incident commander or EOC director to direct the operational responsibilities. So again, delegate authority, monitor, stay aware, and then be ready to implement any policy or actually do the declaration of emergency, which is one of your responsibilities. Delegation of authority is already established for our EOC through our ordinances, in that the town manager or their designee is the EOC director, and all of the necessary authorities for finance, communication, and operations have been given. This is a generic slide. It talks about the legal authorities and restrictions, because sometimes if an EMA team came in and we just gave them authority, we never did that. We held the authority with the director, who was myself or Lauren or Mark. But if we had said, look, you have to run this thing, we would have given them a written delegation of authority that would have been authorized by you, the elected officials.
So here's a question.
Sure.
Let's say in the middle of an EOC, something happens, the EOC director has to give up their authority, assign it to somebody else. How do we, as a legislative body with the Brown Act and all the other rules and regulations, authorize that?
You don't have to authorize it because it's built into our emergency management plan that you approved.
We just approved.
So we have a line of authority, and that director can appoint, as they did me, even though you ended up approving that. There is a line of authority identified for the director. So the director is the town manager, but it could also be the police chief or the public works director or the fire chief. And that's already in our plan.
Right.
But we'll be revisiting that as part of our review of our current 2011 emergency operations plan for the town, to make sure that that's clear. And then once that plan is completed and ready for your approval, you would actually be approving it through the approval of that plan. Does that make sense, Woody?
Yeah,
So the EOC director manages the EOC support and coordination activities, and their job is to keep you informed. And your role is policy, mission, strategic direction, and providing authorities. We've had, instances in the past, and this is where I, just carefully say that the frustration of things not going right will be tempting, create temptations for council members to intervene. I would severely warn about that in advance, is that two things can happen. It can undermine the relationships that we have between the agencies that have been established. And in some cases, it's a clear violation of the Brown Act. You, as a single council member, don't have authority over certain things without a majority vote of the council. So if those responsibilities have already been delegated by a majority vote of the council, and an individual goes out and takes it upon themselves to try to change something, they're violating the Brown Act. That make sense? Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk briefly about public information, which is really going to be the lead into the second part of your presentation today. The public information is managed by the public information officer, who works directly for the EOC director. They might work in conjunction with the Joint Information Center, like we did in the Campfire, where it's many multi-agencies, law enforcement, sheriff's office, police department, CAL FIRE, OES, county, multiple public information officers coming together so that we can all be trying to put out timely and accurate information that's consistent to the public. That's a challenge, as you all know. It's a challenge for that many organizations to come together in a timely manner and release information. But we all know from the Bear Fire or the North Complex that if we don't do this, public confusion reigns in the lack of a clear message, because we didn't have a joint information center between Forest Service and CAL FIRE and the town and the county. Information was not consistent, and it showed up, right? That's one of the things you've already brought up. So that's the importance of speaking with one voice, is kind of where I'm going to hand off this pretty much. Senior officials coordinated, integrated messages through the public information officer, vetted information. We had this thing, and I think Woody might remember this, probably was in one of my morning briefings, is that when you're in the EOC, and this is something I hope is reinforced by Colette, you're going to hear information that has not been vetted yet. So a phone call might come in and say, the fire is spotted into Paradise. And this is, now I'm talking about 2008, not 2018. And you hear that because it came in on the call center, or it came in from another player, or it came in from one of the other agencies. And so now the temptation is you talk to somebody in the phone and you say, hey, I just heard the fire across the river. Well, we fought that rumor for about 2 or 3 days, and we probably had 60 or 70 false alarms in 2008. Well, what I basically ended up doing in the morning as the coordinator for the EOC was giving this message, and it was, the only information that goes out is vetted information, because anything that you say that comes out of this room has the authority of this room, whether it's true or not. Think about that. That's going to be kind of my transition. Last but not least, we're going to talk about incident action plan. So why don't you look at your action plan and just look it over. And I think what you'll see is a fairly clear path for how everyone's going to function over the course of that particular action plan, which was a 2-day action plan. Action planning is fundamental to what we do. It might start out just being verbal. You know, we get in the room, there's only a few of us, we go, look, number one, we got to get information out. Number two, we got to find out where whether there's any road closures or, trees down or whatever the situation is. And number three, we'll have a response to close roads, evacuate areas, open shelters, whatever. It might just, in the initial stages, be verbal, but as it gets more complex, you look at that plan, you see the need for each section, operations, planning, logistics, finance, to identify what they're going to accomplish during that operational period. So we work from action plans, and those action plans are basically our guide of operations for the period of time that they're valid. A day, a few hours, 2 days, whatever the period is. Once we've implemented those plans and we've gone through the emergency and the emergency's been mitigated, then we'll go through an assessment process, which is, in our case, was a formal, hired by another company after action review that's followed by a corrective action report that includes a ton of analysis and critique, and then results in mitigation plans and corrective action plans. So you approved last month, right? The corrective action report from the Campfire. And after action review is really just a hard look at what we wanted to do, what happened, how did it go, what can we learn, and where do we go from there. And last but not least, how do we plan for the future? Well, we make sure that we have an all-hazard plan that delegates the authority. We establish a good system for developing whatever resources that we need, no matter what size of incident or type of incident that we might face. We establish a communication and information system, which is what, it's been a big part of the discussion we've had today, is how do we maintain situational awareness? What's the way that we can best communicate? What do we do when there are communication breakdowns? All those are part of the challenges that we are facing right now as part of the plan that Katie is helping to manage and through the corrective action plan and the long-term recovery plan. And make sure that we are spending money if we need to spend money. We may be coming back to you as a council saying, look, in order for us to do this, it's going to take us investing in, for instance, the PD's new communication system is critical to the future redundancy of the communication within the town of Paradise. So that system that's being, developed by the police department is a critical piece for not only day-to-day operations, but emergency management. We make sure that our personnel are trained. If there's credentialing, meaning their positions training, we need to make sure that they receive that necessary training, like you're receiving today. This is part of our plan. You're receiving the very first training out of the corrective action report. And there'll be a lot more training coming for our staff at all levels through tabletops, courses, and full functional exercises like we've done in this community in the past. And last but not least, leadership. Leadership is instilling confidence that we can and will manage the emergency. And it's always a challenge, but leadership will step up. And I just want to kind of close by saying you have an amazing battle-hardened staff. You have some new people that are going to learn, but we have an amazing group of people in this community who are prepared to do an amazing job to help protect our community. And yeah, we're all learning. I'm still learning 50 years later, but I believe we have great leadership moving forward, and I'm fully confident that we will be able to manage incidents and instill confidence in the public, even with the challenges that we're being faced with. So with that, I open up to final questions before I turn it over to Colette.
questions for Jim?
If you don't have any, I'm good with going. I'm going to listen to Colette, but
It does not look like there's any questions, Jim, and thank you for your presentation. It was very, very enlightening and very helpful, and thank you for what you do.
you're welcome. I hope it serves you well, and I'm sure I'll be seeing you sometime, hopefully not too soon, managing emergency.
Thanks, Jim.
Right, thank you.
So on to item 2B. The town council will receive media training during an EOC from Colette Curtis, assistant to the town manager.
Oh, sorry. Shook me up.
Appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit about council interaction with media during the year. I think Jim did such a great job explaining and touching upon that portion of your role, and I have a little bit more to say about that today. It won't be too terribly long. I'm actually going to end up end my presentation with a brief video from Chris Smith, who is a local filmmaker who did a really excellent documentary. It's a portion of his film that actually deals with public information. Really excellent. And if you have any questions, okay, so information EOC, as Jim has mentioned, we talked about over and over, getting information out to the public is one of the main responsibilities of the EOC. Of course, we have our operations section in the field, who is responding to the incident. Back at the EOC, we are supporting those operations, we're gathering intelligence, and then we're putting the information out to the public, to our partner agencies, everyone else who needs information. So during this presentation, I'm just going to go over the role of the public information officer. That's me. Your role as mayor and council. We'll talk about verified versus non-verified information. Jim touched on that, and I think that's really the cornerstone, or if there's anything you take out of this, is that information. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we learned in the North Complex fire when it comes specifically to public information. Okay. All right. Okay. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about tips about answering questions when media or really anyone. How we respond. So my role as the public information officer, as I mentioned, is part of the command staff. So it is my responsibility to gather the information that is approved and is verified by the commander or the EOC director, and then make sure that information widely as possible. And so that dissemination happens to media, to our cooperator agencies, all agencies involved in the incident, our employees, so we're disseminating that internally to make sure we're all prepared, and also directly to the public, through our social media, through our radio, and our other channels that we have directly to the public. My responsibility is also to coordinate media interactions with which include interviews with our staff and with elected officials. I draft press releases, talking points, speeches, and response to requests for information from the media. So that's, for example, many times the media may contact the town, not just for an interview or with someone from the staff, but wants information about statistical information or something to provide them to help with the story that they're working on. That's the type of thing that I would collect for them as well in planning. So your role on town council, of course, there are many portions where you touch EOC operations, policy, and strategic direction, as you mentioned. When it comes to communications, as he mentioned, it's really incumbent upon you to be sharing the verified approved information that we have so you can speak with that one voice. So really the main roles are coordinating with the town manager, the EOC director, and the PIO for media interaction. That means when media comes and you're able to coordinate interviews, updates, that kind of thing. So doing those interviews and updates. And then and sharing approved public information. So when the town is putting out information that's been approved and vetted, when the county or other agencies that we work with are putting out approved, vetted information, sharing that as well to make sure that is being spread as widely.
Can I say something about that sharing? During the campfire and the aftermath, the few weeks between the fire and when we opened the town again, we had an issue on this council with a person who is no longer on the council, sharing information before it was okay. It was either being verified or it was to be shared in an official capacity, and that person would put it on Facebook before it was supposed to be done. And I think that's part of why we're having this training, to keep that from happening, and we should just say it so nobody's really wondering. It's not that we're trying to keep secrets from anybody, but if you don't really have all the facts and it's not timely to be releasing that information, to do it outside of the official channels, it created all kinds of issues for the town and for the council, so.
But, one of the things, though, on that is that one of the public at the time is, it's incumbent on the EOC and this council or whatever council is sitting here during an emergency and is to get information out to the public as soon as possible. I mean, people were scared, running for their lives, and that in the after action report, that was one of the problems with that fire, was that there was not good communication. The public were not known. So I mean, I hear what you're saying. I understand what we're doing here, and I will follow these rules. It makes sense. I mean, we had the same issue in the 2008 fire, where we had a whole bank of people giving out information. We also had a problem in that fire where the county was giving out some information, we were giving out different information. So that's really an important thing.
It is really
But
important.
the bottom line is that people, during an emergency, they got to know what's going on. Even if we don't know what's going on, we got to say, what, we don't know right now, because we weren't saying anything for the longest time.
But a lot of what Jody is talking about was after the emergency was over with and the in-between time, between the time of the emergency and getting to Paradise. And that needs to be one voice.
But we didn't know, but there was no voice, okay? The bottom
There
line
was a voice.
There was no voice. We were
There
sitting down at
was-
Chico, we didn't know anything, man.
Oh, we're going to have a problem with it.
Yeah, we had a problem with it.
Okay,
That's
all
too
great
bad.
I
comments.
appreciate getting some information.
So, I think that's a really important issue to address, and that's kind of exactly what this next slide addresses. So that's perfect, Councilmember Jones, to talk about, because we have had issues with that in the past, and not just that instance, but many other instances where, and like Jim mentioned in his training, council can, and all of us, hear a lot of information that comes in during an incident. There's a ton of information out there. And there's really two kinds of information, right? There's unverified information. That's just the information you hear all the time. It comes from a variety of sources. Maybe it's on Facebook. Maybe it's someone said, hey, I heard this or I saw this. It could be second, third, fourth hand. You don't really know the source of the information. It's not been verified or approved. That is the type of information that is very tempting to share, because in an incident, especially like the Campfire, although, and Jim mentioned this, the Campfire is such an outlier when it comes to everything. It's hard to use that as kind of the basis for this training. But in any incident, things move very quickly, especially in the early hours. And so their information is hard to come by at first. And so there is, there's an impulse to share whatever information you hear at any given time. But that can be really damaging, because that information many times is not correct or is, maybe partially true. And I think there's a really good example of that I could share from the Bear Fire, which became the North Complex West Branch Fire, is that there was information circulating that people, and these are just members of the public, that heard on a police scanner that was not fully vetted. This was a conversation that was between first responders, and that was, that was taking place in the moment. And yes, it was true at that time. It was what was happening. It was what they were seeing. But that did not ultimately become what the people hearing it thought it would become. And so that information was taken out of context, really, and then put on social media. And a lot of false information and rumors came from that, which ultimately, when an actual evacuation warning did come out of that, and it was very different from what was discussed on the police scanner, there was a lot of confusion, and people didn't believe the true information that came out from the town. And so that was very difficult. And then that put us, all of us here on the same team, in a position where we had to combat that information. Instead of just be able to say, this is the information, this is how you need to act on it, we suddenly had to go back out and say, we know there is a rumor, this is the rumor, it's not true. And it was very, very difficult because it felt to a lot of people like it was good information. And so that's just an example of a way that type of information that's not, fully baked, getting out can be damaging to our goals in getting good information out. And so that's why in my role as public information officer, I am very, very careful about making sure anything that we put out as the town, and anything that I say, of course, is from the town. And unfortunately, because of your role, anything you say also is seen as coming from the town. You're the voice of the town. And so even if it's in a conversation with someone in the grocery store and you don't have your town council hat on, it still could be construed as a message from the town. And so we want to make sure that information has all been verified. We know the source, we know it's good information, and that is the ultimate destination of that information. For example, when there's discussions about evacuation warnings versus orders versus zones, that information, there has to be one decision made, and then that is what is put out, not the discussion leading up to it, because it can be very confusing. And so I hope that kind of explains what I'm talking about here about the information that's in the world. There's a ton of it, and we just have to make sure that what we are sharing in our roles is the approved information. And so when I put out information, I go through a process where it is verified and approved by the EOC Director before it goes out, to ensure that I didn't mishear something or hear some information and it's not correct, because that can happen to me too. So it's a very careful process, and that's why speaking with one voice is really important, because Jody, in the situation you're mentioning, it caused a lot of confusion having multiple voices with information coming out at different times, sometimes contradictory. People didn't know what to believe
was a
or not
mess.
believe. And so it's really difficult, and we really want to, of course, and Councilmember Culleton, you make a very good point that getting information out as quickly as possible is absolutely important, but we have to make sure it's the right information. So it's balancing that.
Yeah, I don't
It's
disagree
finding
with that at
balance.
all. I don't disagree with that at all. I totally understand that. But you mentioned something there, and that's what goes on, because somebody out there, a resident who couldn't get out right away, and they hear two first responders talking, oh my God, and they hear stuff. So then that gets all brought, So if, as a PIO, and we as one voice, because I've seen it happen with other agencies recently, if we know there's rumors out there spreading around the public, we need to make a statement to that. We need to address those things,
Yep.
And try to correct them, because otherwise, we can't just sit silent.
Oh, absolutely. And so that actually is another part of my job as PIO is rumor control. So I
Yeah.
also monitor social media generally for that type of rumor, because that's where it starts and spreads, to find those things that are untrue that we can go out and correct and say, this is the information. For more verified information, follow the town, follow the county, follow CAL FIRE for the best information. So we do that. And I have in the past put out even, at the top labeled rumor control.
Yeah.
Here's the facts, because it happens frequently, and it's just harder, because then that's more of our time correcting that and seeking that out, as opposed to doing other things.
Just like what this training is about, where we speak with one voice, where once something is authorized, verified, public information to be put out there to the public. So when, as a PIO of the EOC or whatever, when we know that there's rumor out there, we probably, in our roles and with our communication abilities, need to be advised of whatever that official statement is, so that we can also help to dissuade,
So our communications, see around, back to me as
Yeah, I'm thinking about that in the complete reverse of that. If you guys hear a rumor, or you see a rumor, whether we report it to you or you get it elsewhere during an emergency scenario, if you come out with an official, let's dispel this rumor, we need to have that official statement so that we can share that through our communities as well.
I know. Okay.
So part of my role as EOC Director is that trust as that I'm giving you information not as force as proof for public dissemination. Right? So if we're talking about that we are monitoring the monitoring, if we're getting information in and we're verifying that, I'm keeping you guys who are on the outside. So you also have to have trust that as that information goes to you, you're not going to be disseminating that until that information. So my suggestion is that share our information. Our information is your information.
Yeah, that's all, that was the point, yeah. If you're combating a rumor, other than, here's the official word on the fire or the emergency, but, hey, here's a bunch of rumor, and it's an official town statement, we need to
But
be
I also
included
have
that,
trust
so that we
you're
can,
going to
yeah, no, we're not,
information.
I'll only speak for myself, I'm not gonna go share whatever I know how this deal works. I'm not gonna be like that other guy. I'll be
Excellent.
worse.
And just for the folks at home and those way in the back, the town manager just explained that in his role as EOC Director, that he will be, continually updating council with information that sometimes is, what would be considered work product, or as we are discussing and monitoring situations, it is not always approved for the public. And so there is a mutual understanding that once that is approved, that information would be shared widely by the council. Great. Okay, so we kind of already, I kind of already gave away the bag on this one, but the lessons from the North Complex fire. And again, I think it's important to remember in all of this information, when we talk about the Campfire, and we all know this, it was so unprecedented, so outside the norm. It's hard to really look at that and take, we can absolutely learn things from that. But the scope of that incident was so different, and the role, especially with the media, and this has come up before, that the role for council and the media in the Campfire was so very overwhelming. It was really very different than what we normally see in even a large incident. We were, inundated by media from, local, state, national, and international press. So it was really, we struggled to keep up with that. And I have to say thank you to those who were on council for stepping up and doing that, because it was a huge lift to manage that. And it was difficult, but we did it. And so in a, more, the type of incident we see, it normally is not that at that level where we have international press coming in and asking for interviews. So, but it's certainly something that is a part of your role and is very important. Normally, again, that picture that we have with the president and the governor, the outgoing governor, the incoming governor, that's not the normal group that we would have. But if we do, that is part of your role.
We don't want to.
No, hopefully not.
Yeah,
Hopefully
we need
never
to talk to
again.
PD and keep those people out.
Hopefully you're interacting with, the Board of Supervisors and
Colette, I have to tell this funny story. So that picture came out, and my son, who lives in the Bay Area, posted it on Facebook with the caption, "My mom and some guys."
I love that caption.
It was pretty funny.
Yeah, because we were getting
He
a
was
lot
right
done.
About some guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, some guys who came that day. So it is a really important aspect, though, of the role that you have, is to interact with other elected officials, to update them, to ask for the things that we need to ask for at that level. That, of course, it would be completely inappropriate for staff to take that role. So that is really important that is part. And again, the scope of this is really different, but the role is the same. Okay, so answering questions, and this, I kind of directed this towards EOC and incident related, but this really goes for any time in answering questions from the media. And these are just a couple of things that I wanted to leave you with before we go to the video. But just, it's so important to always be truthful and transparent. Of course, I know you always would be, but I think, it's so important that the public has trust in what we say, and that is direct, a direct thing that comes from being truthful and transparent and being that way consistently. And so that's just super important. Following talking points to stay on track. It can be really difficult sometimes, especially in the midst of an emergency, when there are many questions coming at you. And it can be easy to kind of lose track of the questions and what your answers should be. And so we do try in my role to provide talking points as much as possible for these types of things so that you can stay on track and at least focus your thoughts to be able to answer these things coherently, because it can get very stressful. Again, only share publicly or public approved information. And so again, it can be tempting to share something that you've heard or inside information you might have, but it's very important to just share what has been approved. There's lots of reasons for that, as we've already discussed. So then what do you do if you don't know the answer to a question? And I know this has happened so many times to all of you, I'm sure, as you've talked to the press. And I would just stress, and you probably already know this, but it's absolutely fine to say, and you don't have to say the words, I don't know, but you could say, I have to look into that further. Let me get back to you. Or we're still working on that. When I have more information, I'll update you. You don't have to answer every question that's posed, and it's much better to say that and defer than to say something that isn't vetted or isn't confirmed or that's, partially true. Maybe you're not sure. And it's very hard. And I say that because it's really difficult when talking with a reporter, as you know, to not answer a question. You want to be able to answer the question and give all of the information that you have. It's just, again, it goes back to sharing the information that has been approved. You don't want to say something that is going to have effects that are unanticipated, right? So there's absolutely no problem in just saying, you know what, let me get back to you on that one. Do you have any more questions for me?
I think the thing that I learned in the Campfire was it's easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of speculation and
Yes.
And rumors and stuff like that. I found our role was best played when we were the calming talk. When people come to us and we just kind of work through it with them and talk with them, but be calming to them. And that meant I had so many people walk away and say, thank you. That makes sense, and I feel better after talking to you, as opposed to getting caught up in all their, issues and stuff that are swirling around in their head. It's not easy. It's not, it's very difficult to do, but I think that's our role. So I just want to encourage everybody to consider that.
And the media is trying to generate conflict and to sell their stories. They're really vultures. I knew this before the Campfire, but it was even more apparent during the Campfire. And they will ask you pointed questions to make you emotional. They will ask you questions that could cause the town to have big political issues. And not only do you not have to answer, you could say you don't know, or you'll get back to them. But if you have talking points and there are things you want the public to know, you can say that instead, even if it doesn't answer their question. I had a lot of reporters try and cause strife between the town and the federal government after Trump's visit. They just wanted me to say something bad about him. At the same time, we're trying to get a bunch of federal money to help us. Right. So just be careful, because they act like they're your friends, but they're not your friends.
I think that's a really good point to just remember. They have a job to do, and they're doing that job, and they're very good at that job. But you also have a job to do that you're very good at, and that is to get the information out to the public that needs it. And so, regardless of what they ask or what their questions are or how they pose them, you can still do your job, and, it's up to them on how they want to.
And I don't know is okay.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
I don't know is fine. That's
Yeah.
an honest answer.
It's an absolutely
I
honest
don't know.
answer. Right. Especially in an emergency, in any emergency. It's difficult, it's chaotic. You kind of learn as you go, you figure out things as you go. But in a case like the Campfire, it is absolutely okay to say, I don't know, or let me get back to you. Next question, please.
Not, I'll
or-
circle back. Don't do that. It doesn't-
What about MSU?
What?
Make stuff up.
No, don't do that.
Please do not.
God, you guys have no sense of humor.
Not in this area.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So are there any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? Anything else that you'd like to add? Go over that. Otherwise, like I said at the beginning, I have a video that I would like to share with you that I think, I think it's beneficial to watch. I know actually I hadn't watched this. I didn't realize this is another segment that Chris added after the initial documentary came out, I think about a year ago. And this is more recent. This came out in December. And it talks about information, and it's very dramatically titled "Information at the End of the World." And of course, this is specifically about the Campfire. But there's a lot of good information for the public, and just in understanding in what the public is looking for in information, what they're looking for. And he also actually touches on elected officials as well. So let me get that started. While I'm doing that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Popcorn?
That-
Popcorn?
It's pieces.
Pizza?
Pieces.
Peaches?
Reese's Pieces.
I already ate one.
And?
Egg? Well,
Sorry, it's taking just a minute to pull up.
Can make it work.
Oh, I can make it work.
This series has been about dealing with disaster, preparing for it, enduring it, and surviving long enough to cope with the aftermath. It's been 2 years since my family, friends, and neighbors lived through the Campfire. In that time, we've mourned those we lost, begun to rebuild, and been joined by thousands of survivors from disasters the world over. Today, we're here with the final lessons, at the core of everything we've learned so far. These are about information, how we take it in, how we use it, and how we pass it on. Information is at the heart of how we make sense of the world and make decisions to keep those we value safe. An emergency may be the most challenging information environment of your life. You could be forced to make a life or death decision going only on rumors. Someone you know and trust may tell you to do something that seems suicidal in order to get out of harm's way. With these guidelines, it's my hope that you'll have what you need to think critically in a disaster and survive like we did. The first lesson is to respect reality. When an emergency strikes, amid the initial danger, there is often a part of our mind that rebels, that doesn't want to accept what fate is presenting. You may feel denial, may be tempted to minimize what's happening, find it hard to take evacuation orders seriously, or think that you alone can outsmart or outrun Mother Nature. My advice? Don't. Just 5 days after the Campfire began, and while it still raged, Butte County Sheriff Corey Honey reported this.
There are other people that have stayed in the area, and I appreciate that. I understand the desire to stay and protect your home, and if they were able to make it out alive, great. I will tell you that there are people who did that did not make it out alive.
Denying hard truths is a human error we all share, but in a disaster, it can be deadly. Another very human response to overwhelming and unprecedented events is confusion. It happens to the best of us.
I remember distinctly the day of the fire, this fog of war, for lack of a better way to describe it, and this constant struggle to gain an understanding of what was happening, to gain situational awareness. It was very disorienting. This started in the morning, but by the time I got to Paradise and as the day waned on, it got darker and darker because the smoke and ash were blocking out the sun. And so despite the fact that it was early in the day, there was this sense that it was nighttime. The other phenomenon that I think added to the confusion was I knew where the fire was coming from, and I could certainly see the glow, and there was ash and embers raining down. But then I would see fires on the other side of me, and the thought would be, why is the fire over there? I don't understand. It's supposed to be coming from there. Now, and of course, later on, I came to realize that the embers that were being blown were setting spot fires all around. And many of those spot fires, there was no one there to report them because everyone was trying to get out. And so you had fire all around you, but no official confirmation of where that was at, which made it very, very difficult to understand and gain situational awareness.
That's what this is all about. Awareness of the dangers, of the routes to safety, of the best decisions to be made. Awareness comes from the information we have, but not all information is created equal. Knowing how to sort good, useful information from unreliable, bad information is key. Think of these three types of information: rumor, reports, and verified facts. Rumors and gossip are informal kinds of information, usually coming to us in conversation or texts from family, friends, and acquaintances. They can be useful, but they are just as likely to be misinformed or distorted, usually coming to us through a chain of people. As we all learned playing telephone as kids, few people in that chain have had first-hand experience with what they're describing. And the personal biases of everyone along the way could mean that by the time it reaches you, you're hearing a story with no true information at all. Reports are something you might get from news media or an official, like a first responder. They may turn out to be inaccurate or incomplete, but the person relaying the information should have tried to verify it first. Remember that word, verify. In fact, this is the reason some journalists are called reporters. Their job is to dispassionately distill the important facts from reliable, named sources. Depending on the news organization, they still may focus on the most interesting facts to keep your attention, but the more reputable news agencies will try to give you the most relevant facts in times of danger. Verified facts are just what they sound like. Known realities, verified, proven, and thoroughly established by experts, recording instruments, and those who experienced or witnessed them firsthand. Naturally, this process takes a while. In an emergency, we usually have to operate without verified facts. So, what do you do? As danger approaches, what is your first decision to bring you and yours to safety? You strike a balance between these two concepts. Get as much good information as possible, but also accept that you will always want to know more. From friends, co-workers, the news media, emergency responders, learn as much as you can. Find out how much time you have before you must act. And this is a good place to remind you of the first responder's maxim. If you think maybe you should evacuate, chances are you should have left already. Err on the side of going sooner rather than later. Because of this, you will have to act before you have learned everything you want to know. This is not a failure, but respecting reality and doing your best. Accept it and move on. I admit, it's easier said than done. How can you quickly sift information to get what's useful? You'll have to weigh a spray of information from family, neighbors and friends, texts, social media, governmental announcements, and news reports. Remember that good information is verified, and verification takes time. Bad information spreads as fast as people can talk, text, or misunderstand. Because of this, it's likely bad information will always reach you before good information does.
The world has changed drastically in regards to the amount of information that people demand, the speed with which they get it, and the accuracy that they expect. And unfortunately, those can be incongruent concepts. And I think people have to understand that in these very complex and dynamic situations, there are things that are unknowable, and the preliminary information that we are able to provide is certainly subject to change based on further analysis. And it's not because we're trying to hide something. It's not because we're dealing with people who are inept or not capable of doing the job. It's that we're dealing with very complex situations that sometimes take time to ultimately get to the bottom.
Here's an asset so good I wanted to give it a special mention. It's called the Breaking News Consumer's Handbook, created by On the Media from New York Public Radio. Among their suggestions, in the early stages of any event, even reliable sources will report incorrect or incomplete information. Check multiple sources. Different news organizations may send reporters to different places and interview different people. Checking on more than one source means you get a fuller picture. Look for news sources close to the incident, with reporters on or near the scene. They have closest contact with eyewitnesses and may be witnessing events themselves, and may better understand local geography and nuances. Be wary of anonymous sources and second and third hand information, and try not to be the source of unreliable information. Big news brings out big fakers and photoshoppers. Be careful what you share online.
We've also, I think, in many respects, lost the ability to be critical thinkers, analytical in our response to the information that we get. And so sometimes this idea of just sharing it or moving it down the road without going, wait a second, does this make sense, or is this really true? There's no quality control, right, in the kind of information that gets out there. And as a result of that, I think people get bombarded with a lot of misinformation or information, that's taken out of context.
That brings us to the cloud that now accompanies most major events: conspiracy theories. When any event has a terrible impact, hurt survivors and frightened witnesses want to know why bad things happen. It's a rational impulse, but some people's understanding is so affected by pain and fear they begin to believe and share explanations with no basis in truth. And some flat out make stuff up. Only hours after the campfire began, I heard the first conspiracy theories spread by people watching the news from thousands of miles away. I had seen the things they were talking about with my own eyes. It was clear to me that some of them were just making things up, just to be involved in the big news story of the day.
There was a guy from the East Coast who sent a letter demanding that I tell the truth about, I think you probably heard that the lasers that set the campfire, and that the children that were killed, and that we were covering things up, and he was going to come and arrest me if I didn't tell everybody the truth about what was going on. So it's just, I think, when you have a big event like that, the 9/11 thing, right? There's going to be the people who have those conspiracy theories, and then they're much more capable of connecting with other like-minded individuals, and I think that creates a bit of an echo chamber in and of itself, right?
Even without the malice of conspiracy theories, the emotional turmoil of disasters breeds rumors. Not only are people desperate to get information in a disaster, they're desperate to give it. Here's something we all experienced in the Campfire. This is Paradise Town Hall as it looks today. Here is Ace Hardware. Here is Paradise High School. They are all still standing. On the day of the fire, according to rumors and social media, they were all destroyed. In the chaos, they were surrounded by fire and looked ready to burn. Passing evacuees, fearful, grief-stricken, reported they had all burned. But what they saw was these places threatened and finished the story with assumptions. Even for the most reasonable of people, emotions breed rumors.
But perhaps we can inspire people in the community who do have the ability to broadcast information or potentially misinformation to be a little bit more critical in their thought. I think one of the things, especially on social media, that I see is that the filter that people have seems to evaporate, and they will make comments or provide information or opinions about things not based on any analysis, but just based on the thought that popped into their head. And then that creates the problem.
For good or ill, the days when news organizations alone informed the public with confirmed reports are gone. In an era when our personal postings on social media may get as much attention as CNN, Fox News, or the New York Times, every one of us has the power to fill the public's awareness. We should only share what we can show is true, and hold back from filling our community's conversation with rumors, irresponsible speculation, conspiracy theories, bad information. So take care before you share. But I think my friends on the Ridge have a better way to say it. Don't stir up shit. The thing is, disasters humble us all. We are at the mercy of Mother Nature. The stakes of what we say and how we act are higher, so we would do well to take a step back before we share more than we really know. This goes double for public officials. Statements public officials give during tragic events may be the most important communications of their careers. After reading through the history of dozens of tragedies, from World War II to 9/11 to the Campfire, it's become clear to me that the best way to communicate is too often shunned by leaders. It's to admit human frailty, admit that we and our information are imperfect. Don't sugarcoat it or cheerlead. Give it to us straight. That way, civilians and public officials alike are going through it together, all on the same page of reality. One thing I've seen in the most respected leaders during these events, they show some humility and authentic emotion amid the turmoil. Now, I return to Corey Honey, the sheriff of Butte County during the Oroville Dam catastrophe and the Campfire disaster. The reason I'm highlighting him here so much in this segment is because he might be the best person I've seen in any disaster at putting this humility and authenticity into practice.
It was an extraordinarily daunting task for us, one, to understand what was going on, trying to craft a message that is accurate, not only in terms of describing the threat, but what the response to that threat is, takes time and can be somewhat difficult, especially as the situation is evolving as you're crafting that message. And then trying to message that across multiple platforms, because nobody pays attention to one specific platform. And so you're trying to message that across social media and traditional media and our emergency mass notification systems, which are also impaired by cell phone towers going down, electricity going down, the network being clogged. And so your mechanisms of getting that information to people in a timely fashion are impaired. And so you're left with this situation where you are trying to put out as accurate of information as you possibly can, but there's no way to verify or guarantee 100% accuracy when you're trying to get it out in a way that satisfies people's desire and need for that information. What I think that people have to come to understand, if there is a demand for information very quickly, What comes with that is the potential that the information is not going to be completely accurate or going to be subject to change going forward. When we would hold our 6 o'clock briefing, I always began my briefing with, "Good evening, everybody. My name is Corey Honey, and I am the sheriff and coroner for the County of Butte. I'll begin my comments as I have done every night since this event began. We're dealing with a very dynamic situation that is rapidly evolving. The information that I have for you tonight is based on the best information I have available today. The situation continues to change, and anything that I tell you tonight is subject to clarification or revision if new information comes in." And I was always trying to set that expectation and let people know.
And I'll say, for me, it was immensely comforting. Someday, the information in this series of lessons may change. We've worked hard to boil down the fundamentals, learned through awful experience, and sifted through cooled hindsight. After the pain and struggle of our experience, I can only hope that you will never need these lessons. But now you have them. Take this as a warning from me. The price is too high to ignore.
He
Thank
did a
you.
great job
Oh,
with that series.
It's a really great series, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch it here today. I know much of this is information that you know. I just think, first of all, he's so much more eloquent than I am, so he can say everything in a very beautiful way. But also, because this is a public meeting, I think it's a great venue to allow the public to watch it as well at this point. And so I will leave you with that. And if there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yep. Yeah, they're on YouTube. This one alone is on Vimeo, but the others are on YouTube. 3 Days in Paradise, the name. Yep, very, very well done. And all on different subjects and a lot of lessons learned. So it's.
Anything else for Colette?
Oh, good job.
Colette,
Thank
great
you.
job.
Thank you.
So with that, it's 3:17. We will adjourn our special council meeting and go to closed session.